Yo, NIA fam, a bit of a scheduling conflict this week. It's summer. The World Cup's happening. Schedules are in flux. So Jack, Bilal, and myself could not lock down a time to get our weekly chat together. In lieu of that, just so happens that I had recorded a solo episode about La Sagrada Familia a couple years ago for a podcast I was doing. I tried it called Caffeinated Deep Dives. I had a couple episodes up there. Feel free to check it out. But one of them was about La Sagrada Familia. And just so happens, time wise, I thought it made sense, or we thought it made sense that we could just throw it up here for you guys if you're looking for content from the NIA feed. Basically, I talk about the history of La Sagrada Familia, its famous architect, Antoni Gaudí. And the TLDR is that when he died on June 10th, 1926, only a quarter of the basilica was done, but he left plans and models, and it took basically 100+ years for the structure to be complete. It's not fully complete, but in February, on the Tower of Jesus Christ, they put a cross which made La Sagrada Familia the tallest church in the world at about 172.5 meters. Gaudi, super devout Catholic, didn't want to outdo God. So while La Sagrada Familia is the tallest church in the world, it's not taller than the tallest point in the city of Barcelona, which is like a hill to the southeast or the southwest. It should be in the deep dive I did. I'm just kind of riffing right now. But the reason I know June 10th, 1926 is when Gaudi died is because on June 10th, 2026, 3 weeks ago, Pope Leo went to Barcelona and he blessed the tower and the cross. And it was a celebration of Gaudi's 100th anniversary of his death and his unbelievable work on the basilica. Now, I don't know if anyone or the listeners are A, in Barcelona right now, B, plan to visit, or C, saw the ceremony and the mass that Pope put together. But I mean, all three of those things, if you're involved in any of it, I saw it, amazing. But the mass was, not the mass, the end of the mass, they had a light show, was crazy. It was like Christopher Nolan did it. And at the very, very end, they had a drone firework thing going on. I don't fully know how to explain it, but they made Gaudi's face. And one of his famous quotes was, to do things right, first you need love, then technique. Some people think this is a Disneyfication of faith. I loved it. My nickname's also Top 40 fan. Like, I listen to Bieber and Drake. So, judge my taste as you must. But we leave this for you this week, and we'll catch up with you guys next week. Enjoy. Peace. Back in the day, no one really cared about the Sagrada Familia. There were some stones and rubble, but it was mostly an abandoned ruin. The situation lasted many decades more. No one really looked up at the Sagrada Familia. Before coming to Barcelona, I knew of Gaudi, but I wasn't interested in him. Slowly, my interest in Gaudi started to grow in me, and today it keeps growing. Gaudi talked with God about something very big and profound. To this day, no one really knows what it is about. I want to touch a bit of that world. Still, Gaudi is way beyond where we are today. So that is a quote from Etsuro Sotu, a 70-year-old Japanese. He's now the chief sculptor of La Basilica Sagrada Familia. For those that don't know, and I'm assuming most of you do, and a lot of you have been there, La Sagrada Familia is Antoni Gaudí's cathedral, or the cathedral started by super famous Spanish architect, sculptor, and artist Antoni Gaudí in the late 1800s. It's like one of the greatest tourist sites in Spain, in Europe. To my mind, it's one of the greatest buildings in the world from my travels. I went there a couple summers ago with my family and absolutely blown away by it. I think this is not like, what I'm saying is not a reaction that is atypical. I think most people, when they see La Sagrada Familia, it's just mind-blowing. So Gaudi's intention with La Sagrada Familia was to put the Bible in stone, to carve the story of heaven and earth and the story of the Bible into stone and turn it into basilica. I'm not a religious person at all, but certainly the feeling of being there was one of awe. And Etsuro Sotu, who I quoted at the top here, his story is quite incredible. He was a 24-year-old fine arts teacher, professor in Kyoto, Japan, when he traveled to Barcelona in 1978. He went there to learn about stone sculptures, and he saw the La Sagrada Familia, and he never left the country. He moved to Spain and decided that the rebuilding and completing of the La Sagrada Familia, which, give you guys a little bit of a timeline, Antoni Gaudí completed about 1/4 of it when he died in 1926. He began the project in 1883, spent about the last 40 years of his life just on this project. Remember, he wanted to create the Bible in stone. That is a lifelong project. Gaudi knew he could not complete the project in time, so he created models and left drawings for future generations. Quite complicated what happened to those models and drawings and how the project was able to survive more than 100 years. It's probably at this point the longest running construction project in the world. But back to Soto, the amazing thing about him was he decided he was so awestruck. Like I told you, I was awed by La Sagrada Familia. I can also tell you I didn't move to Spain and take my family there afterwards. So Soto has been in Spain. He converted to Catholicism to better understand Gaudi. He is fluent in Spanish. He is fluent in Catalan, which is obviously the local regional dialect. And the reason I bring up Soto is because this story and the entire idea of this podcast is ideas coming to life. How do ideas happen initially? What is the spark for an idea? How does that idea carry on into someone's mind or into a community? And then how does that idea manifest itself in the real world, right? So this is the 5th episode we're doing. And last week we did Calvin and Hobbes. And Calvin and Hobbes was about Bill Watterson, the cartoonist, the artist, the creator. And the reason why I want to La Sagrada Familia this week is because a big part of last week was we talked about how Watterson spent 10 years of his life only doing Calvin and Hobbes, completely consumed him. But I think you're going to see something even more extreme in terms of somebody being consumed by something. And it is something more extreme. Like Antoni Gaudí dedicated his last 40 years of his life to La Sagrada Familia. And when I mean dedicated, he had no wife. He had no kids. Truly ascetic. Like he was living in La Sagrada Familia in the last years of his life. He would just wake up, eat burnt toast and dipped lettuce into milk. That was his like diet. Like all he cared about was working on this project. And what is the project? Let me kind of explain. And the notes that I have here are from a Dutch art historian, Gil van Hensbergen. He's got a great book. It's called The Sagrada Familia, The Astonishing Story of Gaudi's Unfinished Masterpiece. So, I mean, I'm not going to do any of this justice. Me describing what La Sagrada Familia looks like is like me telling you what swimming feels like, right? It's like if you read somebody's explanation about swimming, you've never swam before, it doesn't mean anything. But I'm going to do the best I can because this is obviously more so about the mindsets of the individuals involved, such as in particularly Gaudi and then later Soto, the Japanese sculptor who is still working on La Sagrada Familia today. But it's just the idea that an idea can travel. And I mean, I'm going to say it now, it's like, you know how Carl Jung has this famous quote that people don't have ideas, ideas have people? This is an example of that. Like the idea of La Sagrada Familia went from Gaudi, and then when Gaudi died, through the decades, the Spanish Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, it's this church's place in Spanish society over the century. That idea stayed alive, and it found new humans and vessels to express itself in. And Soto, the Japanese sculptor, is the latest example of that. And you'll see from his quotes, like he converted to Catholicism to better understand Gaudi's mind. And I'll discuss how he felt he could express this idea later in this podcast. But again, let me try to explain what the La Sagrada Familia looks like. It's like there's no straight lines on this building, right? It's like, it looks like an organic structure, like it came out of the earth. If you've ever been into the inside of La Sagrada Familia, which has only been completed in the past decade plus, it looks like a forest. And a special thing about Gaudi was, now that we have all these computer tools to see how architecture can be done in terms of physics, understanding the math, like Gaudi saw this over 100 years ago. He studied nature so well that he could see how the branches on a tree or how the roots of a tree could support such large structures. And he brought those ideas from nature into the construction of the La Sagrada Familia. And I mentioned earlier that the intention was for this to be the Bible carved into stone. That's what it looks like. There's these images, there's animals, there's scenes of Jesus, there's 3 facades, right? There's the nativity scene, Jesus' birth, his upbringing. There's the passion facade, which Gaudi did not do, but he left instructions for, which is of Jesus's death and then resurrection. The resurrection has its own facade. And the images here, they all come to life into the structure, which is truly indescribable. You have to see it for yourself. There are 18 towers, which are meant to signify all the important biblical features. There's 12 apostles, 4 evangelists, Mary, Jesus, and Joseph. So it's called La Sagrada Familia, the Sacred Family, because the dedication was initially to Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, the Holy Family. So when this structure is set to be complete, hopefully by the end of this decade, they want to have it completed by the ongoing construction of it is still going on. They want it done by 2026, which would be the 100th anniversary of Gaudi's death. But realistically, I don't think that's going to happen because of COVID. It delayed a lot of construction. But when it's done, there'll be a cross in one of these towers, and that cross will be 172.5 meters tall. And when I said Gaudi's affinity to nature, he studied nature because he was a very devout Catholic. He thought God expressed, and I'm referring to God here, God expressed his plans through nature. So the tower, the highest tower, this will be the tallest building in Barcelona when it's completed, but it's still shorter than the neighboring mountains because Gaudi didn't want to outshine God. So again, whatever your religious bent, I think it's important to know how Gaudi, this individual's belief in a certain religion, pushed him to complete this project and gave him just this insanely long timeline. He often said regarding the project that my client, referring to God, is not in a hurry. So this is kind of like why Gaudi, he spent 40 years just on one part of the church, like of his all plan. Like he knew he couldn't finish it, but he also knew that this would have to be completed over hundreds of years. A lot of churches and structures in England dedicated to the to Catholic gods were built over centuries. So that was a mindset that Gaudi had. Now, the next part I will talk about is kind of like, I had the people don't have ideas have people. That was my first thought. The second idea I had was related to something I mentioned last week with Bill Watterson. And it was referring to an essay that essayist Jen McKenna had written about Francis Ford Coppola. So Francis Ford Coppola was the director of Godfather 1, Godfather 2, and later went on to make the Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now. As covered last week, that war film is extremely tough production. Martin Sheen almost died on set. Marlon Brando showed up extremely overweight, never read the script. There was typhoons that delayed the project from like 40 days to over 250 days. I believe some like crew members died during these typhoons. Coppola was dealing with the dictator in the Philippines at the time, Ferdinand Marcos. Some difficulties, obviously, with that. He had to mortgage his own house to continue financing the film, which went way over budget. Gave up future royalties on The Godfather. But the whole point is, all that struggle that Francis Ford Coppola had, and mind you, struggle here is all relative, right? Because Coppola said something along the lines of, Apocalypse Now isn't about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. And that obviously sounds really dumb to people like me who have Vietnamese relatives, aka my parents, who lived through the Vietnam War and truly did suffer. But the point being that in terms of artistic filmmaking, this is one of the craziest projects ever, Apocalypse Now. And this is what Jed McKenna wrote about Francis Ford Coppola. Be careful what you wish for. Not because you'll get it, but because you'll be turned into the thing that can get it. It's not a process where you just ask for something and it magically appears. It's a process that breaks you down and rebuilds you into the right tool for the job. I mention again the peculiar inability of some artists to understand their own creations at the highest levels at which they can be interpreted. This applies to Orwell, to Coppola, to Shakespeare, and many more. It's a weird thing about the co-creative partnership that the art can transcend the artist. The creation is the point, not the creator. Sometimes we're a partner and sometimes we're just a tool. What was Jesus but God's tool? Muhammad but Allah's tool? Arjuna but Krishna's tool? The universe has no other hands but ours. This applies to Francis Ford Coppola. This applies to Bill Watterson, like we talked about last week. They became tools for the crafts that they convinced themselves they had to do, the artistic pursuits. What Gaudi did, and what so too is following through now, is this times a million. Okay? So, again, La Sagrada Familia is the longest running construction project in the world. Guaranteed it is the longest running church construction project in the world. You might be able to find some other random building somewhere that could maybe get the green light, but I'm calling what a lot of people believe it is, especially also within the architecture community. So I think it's very important that we're studying this and we're understanding that Gaudi believed he was a tool. I mean, he believed he was a tool for God. You don't have to be religious to understand that perception, right? Like Coppola became a tool for Apocalypse Now. Watterson became a tool for Kelvin and Hobbes, which completely consumed him. So we're going to discuss Sotu a little bit later, but he has a quote that sounds eerily similar to what McKenna had said about Coppola. So in a 2020 interview with the Nowness YouTube channel, this Japanese sculptor who is still working on La Sagrada Familia, who converted to Catholicism, who moved to Spain, who is fluent in Spanish. This is what he said. After decades, I concluded I needed someone to cut me, to deform me or transform me. So I realized that by cutting stone, I was sculpting myself. So let me repeat what Sotu said. He spent almost 50 years now sculpting the stone, the story of the Bible, into La Sagrada Familia, finishing Antoni Gaudi's job. I realized that by cutting stone, I was sculpting myself. So we'll talk about Sotu a little bit later, maybe closer to the end of this podcast, because now it's the Antoni Gaudí story. And Gaudi, I'll go through his background, the influences of his life, and how he left kind of a plan for the future of La Sagrada Familia, basically the last century after his death. So regarding the structure itself, La Sagrada Familia, it is by far Gaudi's top work. When he has this reputation as one of the greatest architects ever, it is because of La Sagrada Familia. But he has 90 structures in Barcelona. 7 of them are UNESCO heritage sites. So I picked this one up when I was in Barcelona, this book. It's called the Visual Addition to the Complete Work of Antoni Gaudí. So I know most of you are listening. You might not see the complete works that I'm holding up here, but a couple of the structures, which many of you have probably visited, that Gaudi received a UNESCO heritage, nice check. So when you go on TripAdvisor, you're like, oh, UNESCO, yeah, this looks like something worth visiting. La Pedrera, it's a large apartment building. Park Güell, which is insane. A full park structured in. So like Gaudi has this like Gothic influence, really natural, like we talked about, like nature really influenced him. But he also added in all these, he's also like considered quote unquote modernist because he did like wrought iron, like twisted iron, ceramics, a lot of color. And he did these things in Park Güell and La Pedrera, Casa Batlló, and Güell Palace, amongst other of his 90 structures. But today we'll get into specifically the La Sagrada Familia. We don't have time for this other stuff, and we will be moving through his life story just at this point. Antoni Gaudí was born on June 25th, 1852, in Ruiz, Spain. That is in the Catalonia region of Spain. And for people that are listening that aren't familiar with Spanish history or the European geography, Catalonia is an area in Spain that has long fought for its own independence. It was its own territory for ages before coming under central Spanish rule. And even within the last 20 years, there's been a lot of separatist movements in Catalonia. In Canada, the parallel would be Quebec. Quebec has tried to separate from Canada a number of times. But the point I bring up is because Antoni Gaudí would probably consider himself Catalonian instead of Spanish. Particularly, he lived from the 1850s to 1920s, right? Spain identity and nationality had not been fully cemented until more recently. And again, as I mentioned, there are still separatist movements. But the important part of his childhood was his extremely religious family. And the second thing was that he suffered from really bad rheumatoid arthritis. So to treat this arthritis, he went to a camp called base camp. And this early period of his life, this camp was in nature. It was around forest. It was around lakes and river streams. And this is where he recuperated. And Hensbergen, in his book, makes a very interesting parallel. So Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous 19th century, early 20th century American architect, was greatly influenced with his architecture, the buildings he did in Chicago, a lot of straight lines, a lot of sharp angles, because of the toys that he had played with, that Frank Lloyd Wright had played with as a child, that was given to him by his own mother. You can use the same parallel with Gaudi. So when I mentioned earlier about the La Sagrada Familia, a lot of organic, nature-looking influences within the structure. Well, Gaudi, this is where he got it, at this base camp while he was recovering from rheumatoid arthritis or learning to work through it. Even later in life, he would have to walk hours a day to stay healthy and deal with this affliction. So the influence he saw as a young child, he saw tree branches shooting out in random directions. He saw spider webs and the strength that the spider web had. So he's learning how nature is able to create structures that are both beautiful and functional. Ants carrying extremely heavy weights, cloud formations that would anticipate a storm, washed up seashells with intricate spirals in them, and skeletal structures of dried sea urchins or snakes. And he always believed, as I mentioned earlier, that God's answers were in nature itself. So he really studied every element he could of nature, whether it was animals or the trees, and to see how they could be later in life applied to his architecture work. So one thing that when you do find straight lines in Gaudi's work, which is extremely rare, it's the honeycomb. And if you're talking about function and beauty, I mean, what they're more than the honeycomb. It's like those hexagonal shapes that are made by the bees. You're seeing the strength it provides, and also just visually, it's an insane sight, right? If you actually look closely at those things. So his family, when he's a little bit healthier, moved to Barcelona in 1868. This is a very interesting moment. I talked earlier about Catalonia versus Spain, looking for independence. Well, around that time in the late 1860s, the central government in Madrid, Spain, had actually given and devolved more power to the Catalonian region. And one thing that Madrid allowed was that Catalonia and Barcelona in particular could now set out and make its own structures, decide what a city planning could be, like what buildings it wanted and how it wanted it done. It didn't just have to come from Madrid, the kind of here's what you're allowed to do, the plans, right? It didn't just have to come from Madrid. Barcelona could set it itself with its own Catalonia culture imbued in the ideas. So this also comes not the late 1860s was also a time when Barcelona was booming financially. A lot of trade with some of the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and Barcelona was a pretty interesting town at this time. I guess I call it a town, maybe interesting city area. But what you have to know about Gaudi's parents is that his father was a architect. Maybe not an architect necessarily, but as a craftsman person. But his father really wanted his two sons. One tragically died at a very young age, but helped Gaudi and his brother, or Antoni Gaudi and his brother, study what they wanted to study. And Gaudi did want to study architecture to continue the craftsmanship of his father's career. And apparently, Gaudi comes from 8 generations of craftsmen. So it makes sense that he didn't choose himself to become a craftsman, but he went to an architecture school in Barcelona, and his dad actually sold a plot of land to let him do that. So we actually, mini parallel here with last week, Bill Watterson actually is, I don't know if you remember, if you haven't heard that episode, but Bill Watterson's father used to buy him Snoopy, Charlie Brown, Peanuts comic books. And that's kind of got Bill Watterson excited about becoming a future comic. So it's not really a shocker that a lot of these lifelong experts are the best or the top of their trades, are imbued with that ambition and the skill from a young age. So Gaudi is very much of this ilk. He went to architecture school. His father was a craftsperson. So at architecture school, 3 things happened. So Gaudi had already shown skill as an architect and as a drawer in his teens. But at architecture school is a finishing school, right? It showed him studying perspectives, mechanics, hydraulics, engineering, stress, graphics, topography. So he's understanding all the formal lessons of architecture. But there's also this emotional part. Listen, a lot of us go to college to grow as people, right? I grew by being a total idiot and learning how not to be an idiot when I reached my mid-20s. So that's how I grew. Antoni Gaudi grew in a different way, which is a little bit sad, unfortunately. He grew in 2 ways, actually. He grew by making connections, which a lot of us do in college. The second thing, though, is like college was his way to cope with the death of his mother and his brother, which happened in a short period of time. His sister. And this would actually be a theme through much of Gaudi's life later, is like a lot of loneliness in the sense of he lost family members while he was in his early 20s. And he would spend the last decade of his life almost solely by himself building La Sagrada Familia. So his identity and his psychology was influenced during this period, not necessarily just because of the architecture school, but he was at the exploratory phase of his life. And the other thing was the professional. I mentioned the networking. He met a lot of people, obviously, at architecture school. That was kind of the idea. You get linked up with financiers that want to work on different projects. So he got a lot of professional connections. And when he graduated, his potential was seen by the director of the architecture school of Barcelona, but the potential could have gone either way. This is what the director of the School of Architecture of Barcelona said upon giving Antoni Gaudi his degree. I do not know if we have awarded this degree to a madman or to a genius. Only time will tell. So an interesting thing that happened in terms of the professional connection was that Gaudi started doing some work in a university, and some of his work caught the attention of an individual named Don Eusebio Güell. So you might remember earlier I talked about Park Güell, which is one of the UNESCO heritage sites. It's an unbelievable tourist attraction. I guess that's what it is now when you visit Barcelona. But Güell was a self-made multimillionaire industrialist. And Güell would be a patron of Gaudi through most of his life. And this university period gave him the technical and professional networks, but he also had to deal with a lot of emotional suffering. And as a devout Catholic, he kind of channeled that suffering, and he saw that was the point. Like, he believed and internalized the passion narrative from the Bible of Jesus getting crucified and then later resurrected. Gaudi truly believed that suffering was part of the human condition, and it was an act of discovery. And he did this to himself in the sense of the last 10, 15 years of his life. He suffered almost alone, creating or completing a quarter of the La Sagrada Familia, which we're still working on, or the Barcelona architects and the society, the Spanish society, are still working on a century later. So now we'll talk about how he even got the La Sagrada Familia job. So the La Sagrada Familia story specifically begins in 1872 with a bookseller named Josep Bocabella. If I'm saying that wrong, apologies. I've also heard it say Bosabella. I'm probably butchering it. But the TLDR is that Bosabella, speaking about suffering, he wrote a very popular newspaper, whatever you would consider maybe a newsletter at the time, where he talked about Catholic guilt and helped a lot of local Catholics, which is majority of people in the region at the time, deal with the story of suffering from the Bible and dealing with their own Catholic guilt. And that paper became extremely successful. And he used that money, he stashed it away under his mattress. Like, not like these movies where people put on the mat. He's legitimately stashing cheddar under his mattress. And he decided to take that money after going to Rome in 1872. He thought that a similar version of the basilicas he saw in Italy could be made in Barcelona. And he wanted to do it for La Sagrada Familia, the Sacred Family. He wanted to dedicate a church to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. So they even got a sign off from the Pope and the Vatican to do this type of project. But the trade-off was, on that sign off, if any donations they raised, 50% had to go back to the Vatican. I don't know if that structure still exists now, but that was the kind of the trade-off that Bosabella made to go ahead with this project of creating a basilica in Barcelona. So the first stone for La Sagrada Familia was laid on March 19th, 1882. That was 141 years ago. The construction project is still going on. The original architect, Francisco Villar, is no longer on it. Obviously, okay, that was really, really like not cool of me to say like that. Obviously, he's not on it. What I meant was he wasn't even on it a year later. He quit 1 year into the project from a disagreement with Bosabella. And this is where it gets interesting with Gaudi and Bosabella. Because in 1882, Gaudi is 28 years old. He's quite young and not very established. I mean, the Barcelona director of the architecture school had said it's either a madman or genius. He had skill that people knew about. He had found Güell, a patron. But him getting the La Sagrada Familia job, the one that would consume the last 43 years of his life, was, in a way, a stroke of luck. So what happened was that Bosabella was looking for the next person to take over the project. And as legend has it, he had a dream. Bosabella did. He saw a blue-eyed ginger man in his dream one night. The next day, he went to the studio of a friend of his and saw a person working. Who was the person working? It was Antoni Gaudí. Who had blue-eyed ginger features? Antoni Gaudí. So I'm not sure if this is myth-making, but that's how Antoni Gaudí got the job to do La Sagrada Familia a year after Villar, the original architect, gave it up. Now, what you have to know about the art scene in the 1880s is that there was a time in the Spanish economy, Spanish development, so the 15th, 16th century, when 10% of the country's GDP, or 10% of that region's GDP, because the whole idea of nation states wasn't really cemented at that time. But they spent 10% of any money that made, put it towards churches and things related to upbringing Catholic mythology. So 10% of the GDP was spent on structures and churches and similar, maybe plays, stories, anything related to the Catholic Church. But in the 1880s, you have to remember the scientific revolution at this point is a couple centuries in. You had Darwin's Origin of the Species, about evolution, the book about evolution, which truly changed perception from, hey, God made Earth, to, oh, we're going to fork, and now there's this different part of society. We're just looking at the study that Darwin did and believing that, you know what, this is just the process of evolution. And what that meant for the church in the 1880s was that a lot of the top artists in the world and in Europe at the time, we're talking people like Manet, Cézanne, Van Gogh, Matisse, Picasso, they were not very religious. Whereas 200 years ago, every major artist was their patron was the Catholic Church or somebody that was extremely religious, or B, they were paid just to, all the only works they were going to do were related to the Bible or Jesus. So 1880s, some of the top artists that we look back at now were, I wouldn't say they're atheists, but they weren't working necessarily for what the church, the Catholic Church, the Vatican wanted. This is why Antoni Gaudí would turn out to be such a coup for the Catholic Church, because he was so atypical at his time, because he was very modernist. I had mentioned at the top. He brought a lot of ideas that Barcelona was known for, a Gothic tradition of architecture and art. That is old school. And Gaudí would build on that because Villar, the first architect of La Sagrada Familia, was a Gothic-themed architect. And Villar only finished the crypt, which, if you've been to La Sagrada Familia, that's in the basement area, quote unquote the basement, because most people enter from the top. And that was the first part that was done. And the crypt is done in a Gothic fashion, which, if Gaudi was to do La Sagrada Familia from scratch without this 1 year of work already done, he might not necessarily have done that. But Gaudi was able to combine this Gothic tradition with these modernist techniques that he developed. And these techniques were so modern that it took like 120 years when AutoCAD, computer-assisted design came out. People realized that a lot of the drawings and the models that Gaudi made were proven to be doable by computers like over 100 years later. He understands nature so well. But the point being, he was a big coup for the church. And now, before we kind of go into the development of La Sagrada Familia, I want to talk about how his education and his background influenced the construction, and how this organic look that we see nowadays, how it came about. All right, so in this next part, I just want to talk, remind and summarize some of the influences that Gaudi had as he takes over this project in the year 1883. So what's important to understand about this section is how he's able to marshal the idea. It's pretty clear to Gaudi that he's not going to be able to complete this project in his lifetime. Bosabella, the bookseller, thought it could be done in 10 years, but Bosabella, I hate to tell you, about 130 years over time budget, apologies. But Gaudi did a lot of very smart things in those first few decades with the project. Mind you, he was still working on many other projects. He did over 90 projects in Barcelona during his life, as I mentioned. But to make sure that the ball on La Sagrada Familia can move forward, he did some very interesting things with the actual construction of the project itself. So first, we'll walk through the main influences. Was obviously the Bible and God. As I mentioned earlier, he said, my client, referring to God, is not in a hurry. He wanted to create Bible in stone in the structure. Catalonia, the region he's from, was a massive influence. He himself is Catalonian. Catalonia at the time, in the second half of the 19th century, had a big modernist movement, which is the kind of pane glass, the colored ceramics, and the wrought iron that I mentioned. This is what Gaudi really brought to combine with the Gothic ethic or aesthetic. And then Gaudi himself obviously came from a family of craftspeople, and he studied at the architecture school. And what's something interesting that Hansbergen brings up is that Gaudi also deeply studied Isaac Newton, and he understands physics, or Newton's physics, inside and out. And you'll see this with a lot of the structure that will be proven later, the physics and the understanding of math that he does, because again, there's no straight lines here. There aren't typical support structures. Everything built at the La Sagrada Familia, it's the way it leans. It's a type of arch that comes from nature. It's like the tree branches within the basilica that can withhold massive weights while it's erected up to the sky. So a couple of things that are interesting, and because this is normally a business podcast, what we can learn about applying ideas and bringing them to the real world. So there's a couple of very interesting things about what Gaudi did when he realized that he probably wouldn't be able to finish the project during his lifetime. So remember, he truly takes his project on in his early 30s and does it for about 40 years. So he completed the crypt that was began by the first architect. It took him 7 years to complete the crypt. But the point of completing the crypt was he just had to get a win in. Gaudi didn't come into this project to be like, hey, we're going to start from square one. Let's just forget what was done before. He knew that the donations that would come in to finance the building of this structure, because it wasn't just all Bosabella. Bosabella didn't have that much cheddar to finance everything. Gaudi had to prove that he had A, the chops to do it, and B, the completed project had to inspire people. So the Gothic crypt he completed convinced people he could get a vision of the La Sagrada Familia done. The next part, which would take basically the next 40 years of his life, was what was called the nativity facade. So this is the front, or the area of the church where he tells the story of Jesus's birth and teenage years. And what's interesting about the facade was he knew, and this is why he completed it almost about the early 1900s. So say he spent 20 years on it, and carving in all these super detailed, like animals, the biblical features into the stone. Again, please Google this if you've never seen it. It's very difficult to describe. I mean, it's impossible to describe via audio. But the point why he spent 20 years finishing the nativity facade, or the first draft of it, and the next 20 years truly getting all the small details in, was because, and this is what Hansbergen said, part of the reason for focusing almost exclusively on the nativity facade was that he wanted to set a benchmark of quality and detail for his successors to follow. So it wasn't just that he wanted to set a benchmark. I have to tell you how atypical it is to do a construction project like this. To create this type of church or basilica, you'd want to create the outlines, right? You'd want to put up the four walls, and then put on the roof, and then work on the exteriors after. But that's not what Gaudi did. He realized that to keep on receiving donations, to keep people interested in the project, he had to just do one face of it exactly to his liking, exactly to his vision. Mind you, there's supposed to be 18 towers for this entire project. When he died, there were only 4 towers and 1 facade, one part of the building. 3 other parts were incomplete when he passed away. It was basically just like rubble. So he made a big bet. And the fact that it's still an ongoing project, it's quite clear that his bet was correct. He had to make something so ambitious. He had to express his idea, the McKenna idea of him becoming a tool, a vessel for the idea of La Sagrada Familia. He had to make something so clear, so amazing, that people could carry it on forward. And that's exactly what he did. So he also, during this period, took on different commissions. He did Park Güell during this time, but he learned to take a lot of the learnings from those other commissions and brought it back to La Sagrada Familia. And it would be in the early 1900s when he went full hermit. And I'll run through actually some of the techniques he did and why, when Bosabella thought this would take 10 years, in reality, the facade itself, the single 1/4 of the building took 40 years. It's because you have to see some of the stuff that he was doing. To get the animals in stone correctly, Gaudi would anesthetize chickens and then cast them in plaster, and then take that plaster and then build those animals onto the structure. He did the same. He tried to do the same with humans. He did it to one of his assistants. The assistant almost died. And the assistant's like, maybe I shouldn't do that to humans. He would visit hospitals. And if somebody was about to pass away, he would literally observe that person dying. So in his mind, he could see what it looked like when somebody's soul left their body and went to heaven. This is how far he was taking it. So some of the things that he did to build the structure are so ahead of its time. First of all, he used a lot of models. Frank Lloyd Wright that I mentioned earlier, the famous American architect, he drew a lot. Gaudi obviously could draw, but he didn't think that drawing could truly represent nature, because nature is 3 dimensions. And so he had a famous workshop. It's still there when you go to La Sagrada Familia and visit it. And he left a bunch of models. Well, as many as there are, because as we'll discuss later, a lot of those models were destroyed during the Spanish Civil War. But he built models in 3D for what he wanted La Sagrada Familia to look like. And I mean, he spent decades on these models. And he wanted the 3D because that's what nature is. And he And remember how we felt about nature. That was God expressing the rules of the world. And that's how he saw it. So he would cast the figures, which I mentioned. But here's something crazy about, and I'll read this long excerpt from Hansbergen. So when you view the La Sagrada Familia, these figures, they all look good from the bottom, right? Like you're like 20, 30 feet below what the figures look like. And here's the explanation from Hansbergen, his biographer. For a figure to be high up and read as correct, it didn't just need to be scaled, it had to be distorted and elongated. What was required was a foolproof compensatory method of correcting the sculpture that took into account the perspective of the viewer below. So this is before all this technology we have now, camera technology, CAD technology. So Gaudi would take a picture of just a sample of a statue up top. And then he would bring that picture down, look at it again, make a small change, bring it back up, take another picture. And like he would just have to do this continuously. And think about the photography that was available at that time. But when you see now in the Nativity facade and you're looking up, just remember how he built that and how he's able to show from your perspective what that looks like. I mean, this is similar to the Parthenon in Athens. There are no straight lines in the Parthenon. It was constructed in such a manner where when you see it from below, it looks straight, but everything's actually curved. So as Gaudi's working on this masterpiece with all these techniques that he's bringing way before the necessary technology, Spain and Barcelona and Catalonia itself is going through a lot of political upheaval. The late 1890s, there's a Spanish-American War where Spain loses its colonial assets in the Caribbean, like Cuba, the Philippines, and again, the Spanish-American War, lost it to America. And there's a lot of pushback within Barcelona itself against the local government. So you have a lot of anarchists. And because of what La Sagrada Familia had become, it had become the symbol of the church, the symbol of the establishment. There was a lot of conflict over it. And this would continue for the next century, essentially. And the entire time, Gaudi was still able to push it through. There's threats against the church that would truly manifest during the Spanish Civil War. But we're talking bombings. Like bombings were happening in and around the La Sagrada Familia during this period. But the church was able to survive. Gaudi was able to push it through. Enough people, even a lot of the anarchists, looked at it as a piece of art. And it became bigger than the city. This is just like 20 years in. And we're now 140 years in. Not necessarily bigger than the city, but the idea of it became representative, a lightning rod for the city and for the region. Gaudi himself, in the 1910s, that's when he truly dedicates his entire life to the project. Sadly, his niece and his father pass away in the 1910s. Now he's truly by himself. He's spending all day on the project, has no friends, has no significant other. Mentioned earlier his wild diet, eating a burnt toast bread and dipping lettuce in milk. I mean, that's dedicated to the cause when you can't even bother to have proper food. But this is how far he was taking it. And during Lent, he would give up eating for 40 days. The idea of suffering and Gaudi, like he truly embraced it. And you can see his expression of the story of the Bible, even though he only did the Nativity facade, the Passion facade wouldn't be done until the 1980s. You can still see his commitment to that story from the 1/4 of the church he did complete and from his own life, which sadly, we'll talk about now about his death. He got hit by a tram on June 7th, 1926. And I'd mentioned earlier how he had just completely let go of what we would consider, day-to-day social manners. He just like completely let himself go, basically looked homeless. His pants were kept up by like a needle, and I don't even think he was wearing underwear at the time. It was like a piece of cloth. He was hit by a tram by accident. And because of the look that I just described, people didn't even realize it was Gaudi until much later. like maybe a couple hours, 10, 12 hours later, like the most famous architect in all of Spain. And he died a few days after the accident, and they held in Barcelona what was then the largest state funeral. 25,000 people showed up to say goodbye to Antoni Gaudí. They buried him in the crypt of the La Sagrada Familia. And when we say he died and it's been almost 100 years, you have to understand that 3 decades after his death, the project more or less was frozen in time. Because in 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. And that's when Franco ultimately wins the war with the support of Nazi Germany, the fascist government fighting against communists, socialists, also anarchists. The building was A, neglected, B, the anarchists actually blew up parts of the building, set it on fire, including the room where Gaudi had created models and drawings for future generations to complete it. So we're at that point, after the end of the Spanish Civil War, you go into World War II, and you have parts of what was completed already destroyed. And then you have the future plans kind of blown apart. Like the models are broken, set aside. And the idea, if you'd ask someone in 1936, or I guess 1939, when the Spanish Civil War ended, but the World War II began, if the La Sagrada Familia would ever be completed, I mean, it would be probably 0% chance. 12 people related to the La Sagrada Familia were killed during the Spanish Civil War. They're known as the 12 martyrs. So like, this isn't just a question of, will this church from an architectural standpoint move on? It's like the idea itself is largely snuffed out during this period. And the multi-decade, like, leave it to be dead, like forget about it. The reason it turned around was in the 1950s, the Spanish community, in terms of the international community, Spain was seen as a bulwark against communism because of Franco, a fascist still in power, was basically slowly reintegrated into the international community for the Cold War of America versus the Soviet Union. And as Spain is brought back in the international community from the Western standpoint, there's a bit of a tourist boom. And Western tourists start visiting Barcelona. And there's a lot of interest in the La Sagrada Familia. In the 1960s, there's a lot of debate now. So still in the heat of the Cold War. The question, though, becomes, as more people see the La Sagrada Familia, is like, should we finish this? Should this be completed? The argument was essentially that Gaudi, a lot of people are like, from an artist's perspective, is like, you shouldn't finish an artist's work without the artist. That's one perspective. The other perspective, which is obviously won out, was you should finish this idea because Gaudi's idea, it wasn't about Gaudi. It was about, well, in Gaudi's eyes, it's about God. So that idea obviously won out. And what's interesting is that as interest in the La Sagrada Familia grew, and mind you, remember I mentioned Etsuro Sotu, the Japanese sculptor who visited in the 70s? Interesting, the church grew, that project, but Gaudi himself was considered, not great. People looked at a lot of his works. It's pretty crazy, right? Like Orwell, I'll give you an example. Famous people that hated it. Picasso hated Gaudi's work. Orwell hated Gaudi's work. And they thought that he had combined all these elements of nature, of Gothic, of Catalonian modernism, and added his own perception into everything. A lot of people thought it was really ugly. And even now, people think it's ugly. You go to TripAdvisor, read some of these reviews, and you get the full spectrum. I think I've already made it clear what I think about Gaudi's work, but his reputation wasn't really rehabilitated until around the year 2000. But I got to mention a couple of things before then. So a big thing with Barcelona re-entry into the global community was the 1992 Olympics. That's the dream team: Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson Olympics. Freddie Mercury from Queen even made a song called Barcelona in the lead up to the Olympics. So Barcelona was truly a global city after 1992. And the Sagrada Familia itself, as construction restarted on in the 70s and 80s, a really important sculptor was Joseph Maria Subirax. He worked on the Passion facade, very controversially. People think he made it extremely ugly. Subirax, actually, this idea I mentioned earlier of ideas don't have people, or people don't have ideas, ideas have people. I mean, he's kind of like this. He was one of Spain's top sculptors at the time. He agreed to do Gaudi's work as long as he was allowed to live in the La Sagrada Familia. Much like I'd mentioned about Etzura Sotu, he wanted to see through the eyes of Gaudi and express Gaudi's ideas. And it's just that when I talked about how Gaudi put so much effort into that nativity facade, I mean, I think you're seeing, and we saw decades later how that manifested itself with other people wanting to take up the flag, right? Wanted to complete the effort that he did because they saw how much effort he put into it. And we'll talk a little bit more about, I think, how important it is to, when you're truly doing something, how ambitious this project is. Going that extra mile just completely changes the probability of it being completed, because you've convinced so many people of your effort and of your genius that all they want to do is complete it. So the year 2000 is when Gaudi, 2002, it says here, at the 150th anniversary of his birth, is when he was fully rehabilitated. This is 10 years after the 1992 Olympics. Barcelona, super international, super touristy city at this point. Millions of people visiting the La Sagrada Familia. Today, we're talking maybe 5 million people visit it. They pay about 10 to 20 euros to go inside. All that money, about 20, 30 million euros a year, is going to finance the project. For the longest time, as I mentioned in the 60s, 70s, there's a question as to how this thing would be financed. Now there's no question. The project, there's so many tourists that just visit it. And then even just like, there's over 10 million people a year just on the outside looking in. There's so much attention around the project that there's no question now they'll be completed. But the other thing that happened in the early 2000s, which we'll discuss a little bit later in a lot of detail, was the new architects that jumped onto the project. So not just sculptors like Subirax, but a lot of super talented architects were starting to use computer-assisted design. And they began to realize that Gaudi's initial ideas around the arches, the tree-like structures, was possible. And they could actually model it with these tools. And what's interesting, there's a great 99% Invisible podcast on La Sagrada Familia, and they interview Mark Burry, who's an architect and worked on the La Sagrada Familia project for a number of years. They interviewed him, and Burry talked about how the designs that Gaudi had laid out, it's called parametric designs, is, it's not straight lines. It's like these shapes, these circular shapes, these spherical shapes, these shapes that seem or super organic. You could actually model those out in CAD software, computer-assisted design software, to show you how architects and people in construction could actually build it out. Burry was talking about when he was looking at it in the 90s and early 2000s, the most powerful technology for this type of modeling wasn't even available to architects. It was like in the aeronautical industries. And the computers had not even reached a point where they could model out the type of stuff that Gaudi had envisioned. All right, that takes us to 2010, which Hans Bergen, Gaudi's biographer, says was probably the second most important day in La Sagrada Familia's history, after the first stone was set in 1882. That's when Pope Benedict consecrated La Sagrada Familia. And I'm sure there will be future very important dates when the project is completed, probably by the end of this decade. But now we can go into the awards section. So for the listeners that do not know the awards section of this podcast, it's borrowed from the Rewatchables podcast, which is from Bill Simmons' The Ringer. Basically, they do awards for films, kind of offbeat awards, but I borrowed some of the categories and I'll walk through them right now and give you what my answers are. They will assuredly be different than what you would answer, but feel free to yell at me if you leave me some reviews too while you're at it. But we'll start with Apex Mountain. So Apex Mountain is the idea of what from this story kind of reached its peak. And I mean, an easy one would probably be, is this the best basilica or church in Spain? Probably. If you want to argue with me, please let me know. I'm not an expert by any measure. But my Apex Mountain, the category I kind of liked was that, has there been an architect as closely associated with a city than there is Gaudi with Barcelona? So Gaudi, again, has 40 structures in Barcelona. 7 of them are UNESCO heritage sites. There are certainly other architects that are very closely related to the city. I mentioned one earlier in this episode, Frank Lloyd Wright with Chicago. The other person I would consider kind of this ilk is Georges Eugene Haussmann. He worked under Napoleon III, and Haussmann oversaw massive urban renewal of Paris over 20 years. He dramatically transformed the entire city structure and infrastructure, super well known for the wide boulevards in Paris. Actually, that construction was borrowed also in Ho Chi Minh City, which obviously was Vietnam was a French colony for decades in the late 19th century, midway through the 20th century. So I think Haussmann is the other person with Paris that you could probably make that connection to. I'm probably missing some other ones way back when. My history that I'm working from is from 19th century on. So let me be more specific. One city architect plus one person would, from the mid 19th century, I'm going to say Gaudi is Apex Mountain for that. What has aged badly? I'll tell you what's aged badly is Picasso hated Gaudi's work. He hated the La Sagrada Familia. And you know who else hated it? Is George Orwell hated it. George Orwell, who famously wrote about the Spanish Civil War. He was actually at the front lines of the conflict. He wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia. He was present at the Spanish Civil War. He had said that it showed bad taste for the anarchists not to blow up the La Sagrada Familia. I'm going to say that those quotes aged badly. I don't have an exact quote from Picasso, but what's funny is part of Picasso's hatred too is that I don't think Picasso was a fan of Salvador Dali, and Dali was a huge supporter of Gaudi, but he may not have actually helped Gaudi because he was also a super controversial figure. But here is what Dali said about Gaudi in the positive. Those who have not tasted his superbly creative bad taste are traitors. So that dichotomy of expression that Dali had kind of gets it. It's like when you look at a lot of Gaudi's work, you're just like, what is going on here, right? It's just shocking. But then when you let it marinate, well, if you're like Orwell, you hate it even more. But if you're like me, like you just walk away shocked. Or if you're at Tsuru Sotu, you pack up and leave Japan and go move to Spain for 40 years, right? Like that's what's interesting about Gaudi's work. It really does split people. A lot of people do think it's just like, I mean, the church looks like it's dripping stone. Like it's just so indescribable what's going on there. So I'd say that aged badly, probably Orwell's quote specifically. Notable prediction. What I'll say on the prediction side is this. So the notable prediction that held up is all of Gaudi's drawings, all of Gaudi's models. He did not have computer-assisted programs, right? He didn't have CAD. He didn't have ChatGPT. He didn't have Google. He didn't have any of this powerful technology. He didn't have NVIDIA GPU chips. And he was creating models that proved out that could be done. And it took centuries and extremely powerful technology could prove that his models were correct. So I would say that his predictions on creating these structures were the best ones. Those are the notable predictions for this episode. So what I'll actually show you here is, like I mentioned earlier, the episode from 99% Invisible. So one of the things that really stood out is the Catenary Arch. And 99 Invisible, Roman Mars interviewed an architect about the arch, and this is what the architect said. So the catenary is a curved shape that a hanging chain assumes under its own weight. So picture an electric line suspended between two utility poles. So imagine you're holding a string, or you look at the electric line. It kind of like swings down, creates a semicircle, right? That's a catenary arch. That shape is actually extremely structurally formidable. It's stable. But what Gaudi did is like what I just described to you is like a U shape. He flipped that U shape. And that structure that he does is that arch is found all over the La Sagrada Familia. Because what happens is that arch distributes the load weight of the rest of the structure in such a way that you don't need like straight lines to hold up this building. And now, I mean, they've truly taken the design of these, because they're finishing all 18 towers, and they have to build the 18th tower with the cross that will be the tallest point in all Barcelona. Like at this point, they're using a very interesting cement steel combination construction techniques. But the whole point is that Gaudi, a student of nature, and well, he called the book of nature, and he had just predicted all this just from studying nature. So I would say that's the best prediction. So what is the big winner? Who's the big winner from La Sagrada Familia? It's me. It's people like me. I mean, 5 million people pay to go in every year now. 10 million people just look from the outside. When I say that I'm the winner, what I mean is, if this is truly the longest going architecture product in the world, right? Architecture project. And, you know, in our society, how everything is so ephemeral. Like that's the criticism of the modern society. People don't have long-term thinking. What more for a symbol of long-term thinking than the longest construction project in the world? Whether or not you believe in God, what is it that when Gaudi said, my client, referring to God, is not in a hurry? What is the value of that? The value of thinking that long-term. Could you even like create this again, right? No, I don't think you could. I think everything I've described in this episode, the insane ability of Antoni Gaudí, the majestic nativity facade he left, the vision that he left, that lasted, that gave the energy, the fuel for 140 plus years for people to complete this project. Can you imagine starting something today that will last 140 plus years? Think about how difficult that is. Like in terms of buildings, what government are you going to convince to let that happen? Maybe it shouldn't happen, right? Maybe you shouldn't assign this many resources to a project for 140 years. You probably shouldn't. But that's what makes this such a big win for us, because there's something out there which we can, as society, look to. Whether or not you think it's ugly, whether or not you think it's a waste of resources, whether or not you are religious, your feelings about the Catholic Church, that structure, the La Sagrada Familia, is at least one thing where you could say, oh, here's something that was 140 years in, right? We're still trying to complete it. And I think that's a win for society. That's my perception. The loss, who's the biggest loser from this story? So this is kind of related, but you know, the neighborhood around the La Sagrada Familia, the construction been nonstop. The tourists have been nonstop. I would say that they're probably the biggest loser, if we're being honest. I mean, not everyone's happy about this project, right? I just mentioned it. And there's even an arson attempt as recently as a decade ago, or I think around 2010 at the La Sagrada Familia. Not everyone likes La Sagrada Familia. Let's be clear. Everything I said about me and us and society being a big winner for this long-term thing, the contra of that, the second side of that is the idea that, people around it are not necessarily happy. I'd probably be pissed too if I had 10 million tourists rolling up around my neighborhood all the time, because people live in that area. And one of the reasons I believe they have to finish it by 2030 is I think there's some like construction ordinance where if they don't finish it by then, it's gonna be a lot harder to do. So that would be the biggest loser. The next category, are there any substitutes? No, there are no substitutes. There will never be a building like the La Sagrada Familia. apart from Gaudi's genius, is just to get the buy-in to do this would be absolutely insane. The biggest what if. So the what if category is, what if something had changed? Last week, for example, for Calvin and Hobbes, I said, what happens if Bill Watterson had allowed Calvin and Hobbes be made into a film? Well, that's a big what if. The Apple what if was, what if the first episode I did was about the iPhone. The big what if there was, what if they had created the original idea for the iPhone, which is like the iPod with the circular wheel. That's a wild what if. Of the 5 episodes I've done in this podcast, this is the first reverse what if I've done. And what do I mean about reverse what if? Reverse what if is, I'm about to list you all the insane things that happened for La Sagrada Familia to go down. The what if here is, if none of these things were in place, like we're talking about path dependency, one thing had to happen for it to continue moving forward. If none of these things fell into place, this project, this 140 plus year project, one of the greatest churches in the world, would not exist. So here's the reverse what if. Okay? So I'm quoting Hansbergen here. He mentions a couple of things that La Sagrada Familia survived. Well, first, let me say, remember the dream that Bosabella, the bookseller, had? So there's the big first what if. Like Bosabella had to convince the Spanish government at the time to let a basically no-name Antoni Gaudí, late 20s, still unproven architect, take on the most important project in the city. And he convinced them by saying he saw someone in a dream that looked like Gaudi. So there's that what if. Let's add on all the other things that happened in the last 140 years as a what if. This is from Hansbergen. The Sagrada Familia project also managed to survive the terrible fallout of the disastrous 1898 Spanish-American War, the convent and church burning of the tragic week of 1909, the horrors of the First World War, the Great Depression, the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the War on Terrorism, and the catastrophic financial meltdown of the early 2000s. So this is the reverse what if. There are so many ways that the La Sagrada Familia could not have been completed. And I mean, I just gave you like the 50,000 foot level stuff. That's the stuff that it had to go through from the highest level that impacted all of society. And now we can throw COVID in there, right? It's going to survive all that. Although what I will say is that basically since 2002, and particularly since Pope Benedict consecrated La Sagrada Familia in 2010, the money from the tourist boom has just been nonstop. Again, it's 20, 30 million euros a year. 4 to 5 million visitors that pay that. And then the $10, $20 or 10, 20 euros, and the 10 million people just standing outside looking at it. Like the mind share here is incredible. So I would say that is the biggest what if. Where I did substitutes. All right, so that takes us to the biggest lessons. And listen, this is normally a business and tech podcast, or lessons we can learn to create stuff, to create something. And here's what I'll go away with. 3 ideas and some quotes from related people. The first lesson is, time scale changes everything. I've mentioned it before. I'll say it again. Gaudi said that his client was not in a hurry. Now, I'm going to take that to a very business level by quoting Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. And this is a much smaller time scale, Bezos' quote, but the point being thinking long-term and what that unlocks. So this is what Bezos said. If everything you do needs to work on a 3-year time horizon, then you're competing against a lot of people. But if you're willing to invest on a 7-year time horizon, you're now competing against a fraction of those people. Just by lengthening the time horizon, you can engage in endeavors that you can never otherwise pursue. How many people are working on a 140-year endeavor? Probably not many. And yes, it's difficult, right? But the point being, the La Sagrada Familia is an example of something from the very beginning that was an extremely a long time horizon. And Gaudi was even asked, like, as we're going through these macro events that I kind of mentioned, what happens if it gets destroyed? And Gaudi just said, we'll just rebuild it. The second lesson I have here is the idea of building something larger than yourself, which is basically what happened here, right? Gaudi, within a decade of starting this project that he spent over 40 years on, he knew he wouldn't be able to finish it. And he left plans for the next generations. And that's something that I guess is lost in the ephemeral aspect of modern society, right? It's like, think how quickly you can spin up a company, a software company, a DTC business. And you can literally do it overnight. But the ease of doing something also means that you can just drop it and start something else, right? And, I'm guilty of this. I've tried a lot of many things that didn't work out. And that's fine. It's good to experiment. But I think maybe looking back, a lot of things that I did quit were just because I knew how I could just jump into something else, right? So that mindset of thinking long-term, of building something just bigger than yourself is the La Sagrada Familia is one of those lessons. Is like, it's truly from Gaudi's start, something he identified that he had to pass this project along. The other lesson I have here is trusting your own taste. Gaudi obviously trusted his own taste. So there's a quote from somebody that worked with Gaudi, or I guess in Spain at that time, or Barcelona, not necessarily worked with him, but it's like, you either got to kill Gaudi or tell him that he's right. As in, Gaudi believed what he believed. And again, he's taken a lot of this from, like, in his mind, he's got this mandate from God. But he really instilled himself into the building as an instrument for God in his mind. So this brings me up to something that Rick Rubin, super producer, has said about taste, is that this might not be an exact parallel, but for how much of Gaudi's own mind and own taste is so clearly in La Sagrada Familia, despite people like Picasso, people like Orwell hating the look of that structure, and they are like representing a lot, thousands of millions of people that look at the La Sagrada Familia like, what is this, right? Here's what Rick Rubin said. You can't second guess your own taste for what somebody else is going to like. It won't be good. We're not smart enough to know what someone else will like. To make something and say, well, I don't really like it, but I think it's a group of people will like it. I think that approach is a bad way to play the game of music or art. Do what's personal to you. Take it as far as you can go. Really push the boundaries and people will resonate with it if they are supposed to resonate with it. But you can't get there the other way. The other way is a dead end path. The other way being, I wonder what the reaction will be, and I'm just going to try to guess what that reaction will be, and I'll make it. But whereas if you express your own taste, it will find the people that will like it. And clearly for Gaudi, it found hundreds, if not thousands, of skilled practitioners, craftspeople, architects, sculptors to follow in his lead to finish this project. Which takes me to the end of this podcast, and it's about Etsuro Sotu, the Japanese sculptor, the chief sculptor that I mentioned at the top of this podcast. I'll give you more details about him, but he most recently finished the marble doors on the nativity facade, and he's working to help complete a lot more of the ornaments. And then when the towers go up, he will do a lot of the sculpting on those. But he said something in a 2018 lecture that he gave in New York. And I'm quoting him. He says, create art that is alive so that millions of people that come in contact with it can gather its fruit and learn and internalize that art. And, when you look at the La Sagrada Familia, it is the Bible written in stone. And I think it's about what Sotu's saying is that it came alive, and it came alive because it's a vessel for this idea, right? And how powerful the idea that Antoni Gaudí laid out. And I'll leave one last quote from Sotu because I started with him. Sotu said in that 2020 YouTube interview with Nowness, he goes, I must cut stone to be able to answer this question that burns inside of me like a magma that I cannot control. I ask myself, why did I feel such an urge to cut stone back in those days? After decades, I concluded that I needed someone to cut me, to deform me or transform me. So I realized that by cutting stone, I was sculpting myself. It's that idea that he became a tool to see through this vision. It was the idea that I mentioned in the Jed McKenna essay. Is like, if you convince yourself of a creative venture, a creative project, you will turn into that tool. The world will turn you into that tool to see that project through if you truly believe it. So with that, All I'll ask is thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed any of that, or you are inspired to work on some stone sculptures, please leave me a review, share this podcast with your friends, family, Japanese sculptor friends, and definitely pick up the book by Hans Bergen, the Sagrada Familia. And I'll be back next week. Thank you so much for your support.